Attention human, prepare yourself for the Double Pipcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Double Pipcast, where almost every week we talk about the goings-on within the Transformers TCG universe. With me, I have Kevin Allen, winner of the EIQ at Gen Con in 2019. How you doing, Kevin?
Pretty good. How are you?
Doing great. Hey, Kevin, so I've had on Dan Arnold, Stefan Pinkney, and now you, what I would say the big three in the conversation from 2019 as it concerns the Transformers competitive scene. And I've asked those two the same question, but what is your background in the CCG?
I have been playing off and on since early days of Magic. I got into Magic about the Artifact cycle, so second or third expansion. I played for a few years, and I've been in and out of a variety of card games and CCG since. I tend to be kind of a recovering addict when it comes to CCGs. I decide they aren't worth the money, and then something new and shiny comes out, and I relapse. So I spent a lot of time in Decipher Star Wars CCG. I've done a little bit here and there with Netrunner, most recently with Star Wars Destiny, and when I saw Transformers, it very much called back to my childhood and really hooked me in. The art, the G1 characters really got me, and the more I looked at the game mechanics, the more I loved it. And so this is my latest relapse, and I'm loving it so far.
Awesome. The Star Wars bit. So you played Star Wars, a card game, and then you played the dice game as well.
Yep. Yes, very, very different games. Although, interestingly, a lot of what I saw in Transformers kind of called back to some of the things I loved about the Star Wars CCG from Decipher. With the pips are very comparable to the Destiny numbers that they had there, the flips being involved off of your deck, the very fast cycling. Yeah, it had a lot of that. I really like that kind of a mechanic that makes it about more than just the cards and their effects and who can draw what.
Yeah, there was a Star Wars game, I don't know if you ever played it, called Epic Duels that came with decks. It was either a Hasbro or a Mattel game that was awesome. It was miniatures and cards in a box, and actually fetches quite a high cost, high dollar now. But
yeah, I bet. I don't think I ever played that one.
So the Transformers trading card game, you said that it called to you. You called it your relapse. One thing that helps me get invested in something is enjoying what I'm doing, enjoying what I'm playing. And in past interviews, I've heard you kind of talk about your ethos in terms of what you like to play. What in your fellow competitors, they said that they recommend playing something that has been proven competitively already, as opposed to coming up with your own thing. Would you agree with that?
I think it depends a lot on what you want out of a game. Dan and Stefan, massive respect to them, are much more competitive players than I am. I tend to go to some big events, but I play mostly for the love of playing. And so I think for someone who wants to get into a more competitive place and be really competitive, then I think their advice is great. For me, win or lose, I want to enjoy what I'm playing. And that means in a lot of ways coming up with my own. I will take inspiration from decks online, but I will tend not to just straight out copy someone's deck. I need something interesting in the deck that I'm going to play. I whether it's the characters that are involved from a theme standpoint, or the style of deck that I play, or the mechanics, something in there has to be enjoyable for me. And a lot of times that means I'm honestly a middling level player. I think I'm a pretty good player. I'm good at dealing with game states and that sort of thing. but that I will freely admit puts me often into a little bit of a hole. And Gen Con, it worked out for me. I had something, that I loved playing, but kind of caught the meta off guard. I still think, and worked out very well for me that day. But generally speaking, I will always prefer to take something that I've built that I enjoy playing, as opposed to cramming myself into a box of what happens to be the best in the game at the moment, if I don't really enjoy it. I would rather enjoy playing and play something I like and have a middling finish than go for that must in top 8, top 4 every single time. And it's just a different mentality in how to approach the game.
Yeah, and it's, if you go into that knowing that's your goal, is to have fun and be invested in what it is you built, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that's refreshing for some folks to hear, although results may vary. It really depends on how, your experience with strategy and things like that. But yeah, definitely enjoy it. And if you are invested in it in a way where you want to be number 1, number 2, or like you said, top 8, there are proven decks out there that can do that for you.
Yes, certainly.
Speaking of which, have you been to any recent events this year?
Yeah, so I went to the invitational at PAX Unplugged. That was one of my days that didn't go so great, although there were some other things going on there too. And I actually found out while I was there about the Pro Play Tour event in Vegas, which was like a week later. I live in California, and so that night at PAX, I called my wife and I was like, "So, you want to go to Vegas for a weekend?" And thankfully, she's wonderfully supportive, and it sounded like a fun weekend. So I went and I played in that as well. And I'm actually gearing up this coming week to go to Orlando. I did well enough in Vegas to earn an invite for the Pro Play in Orlando. And going out a couple days early, I'm going to do some diving and turn it into a little trip. I will very rarely make that big a trip just for the sake of playing something like Transformers, but if I can combine it with other things, and like I said, I'm a diver, and so a chance to get underwater at the same time is pretty exciting, and so it should be a fun weekend.
Awesome. Have you ever been to Florida?
Yes, I have. I've dove Boca Raton and been there just on visits a couple of times. It's beautiful diving and a wonderful place.
Awesome. That's great that you can kind of roll those two things into there, and it helps to have a supportive spouse.
Yes, and my wife is incredibly supportive of all of my hobbies and everything I do. And she dives too. She's not going to end up making this trip, but she's also a diver and is more than happy to go along with the trips. And I'll go play cards, and she'll do whatever she's going to do for the day.
Great, that's great. In one of your past interviews, I think it was with Cameron over at Arbitrary Hero. You all discussed the meta and the echo chamber that our community can create. Do you feel that the game is too young and the card pool is too small, and further, we don't have enough reps to say that there is a meta or that the game is solved at this point?
I don't know that I would say the game is solved. I think a meta will always exist. I mean, the meta is always just going to be what everybody happens to think is the best, right? Meta is all about predicting what everyone's going to have and trying to come up with things to counter it. The meta is going to exist. I will say it seems like our meta tends to bounce around very, very rapidly because of the conditions you mentioned. I think we saw this coming off of the earlier pro play events after Stefan won, and then I believe it was Kyle in Dallas, both won those events with Shockwave, and all of a sudden everyone was taking a much harder look at Shockwave, and when I played in Vegas after the week after the Invitational, it was easily half the decks there were Shockwave, including me. I was running something a little different than others, but I was on board with that for some personal reasons. And so I think that the meta is there. I think it tends to evolve very, very quickly, but I think the game is a long way from solved, and I think that you can still see people coming up with very, very unexpected things. I actually think that Dan did that at the Invitational. I think a lot of people looked at Galaxy Prime and didn't think a 15-star character could build all that much of an effective team. I give major props to Blaine Bublitz. Excuse me. With his, regardless of what you think about the deck, and whether or not it should exist, the depth of mechanical understanding that he put into his Daring Escape deck with Springer deserves a massive amount of credit. And so I think we are still seeing cases where things are evolving, and people are still surprising the community in a lot of ways because of that. And I think it's going to be a while before that settles out. I think that there's a deceptive number of moving parts in the game between cards, effects, draws, pips. And so I think that there's a lot to be discovered there, and people are going to come up with surprising things.
Yeah. I think you're right there. And there's cards still that haven't been brought out of the limelight or brought into the limelight that really they may at some point, whether that takes an introduction of more characters and more mechanics, or someone to try something out, and and then, like you said, it's very volatile, and then whether or not that gets surfaced. I mean, if it's not surfaced or anything like that, it could just be secret until it's not.
Right. And the other thing too, and this is something that I will admit, I don't tend to participate in national level CCG communities to the extent that I kind of have been with Transformers, but I think there's always something with big events, and even with Gen Con having won it, we tend to, as a community, look at those and think that this is the best. But I mean, a lot of it's the best of who could be there. And at Gen Con, we've got a couple players here locally who regularly clean my clock, and two of them made the Energon Invitational and did very, very well when I had a really rough day. But they weren't at Gen Con, they weren't at Origins. So I think there's a lot of players out there who play in a local scene and do very very competitive and original and creative things that a lot of times we just don't see because they don't surface, as you said, at those big events. And I also I tend to think that the competitive pushes things, but I think casual and pushes creativity in a way that competitive sometimes doesn't. Where people will be a lot more willing to just try random things, and every once in a while that lightning's going to strike, and someone's going to go, "Holy crap, that really worked!" And maybe it survives under a larger meta microscope, and maybe it doesn't. But I think that a lot of the innovation comes from those kind of communities as well.
Yeah. So would you say, so that kind of the point where you said it's the best of who was able to be there, and then that's considering all the variants that there is with a game like this. So correct. Under the circumstances that we had, under the way that the cards fell, that was what came out number one.
Yes, and even to the point of matchups, especially once you get into elimination rounds, any deck out there, you're going to have good matchups, you're going to have bad matchups. And if you happen to get paired going into the top 16 or 8 against good matchups versus bad, it can really swing a day. Now that said, there are definitely within that variance, there are players who very regularly show up at the top, and you have to recognize and respect that.
So the let's call it the aftermath of looking back at Gen Con, the aftermath of your win created quite a bit of talk around the Cliffjumper card, for better or for worse. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like that is just the state of the internet now, or is there really some merit in the conversation that stemmed from that?
I honestly think that it's both. I think the way we discuss things these days, especially with the internet, everything ends up turned up to 11. There are no minor grievances on the internet. Everything is the end of the world. I completely understand the distress that some people have with the idea of exclusive cards like Cliffjumper and the difficulty of getting them. That said, I think a lot of people are, for lack of a better term, a little PTSD'd over previous similar cards in Magic. I understand there was one that was completely broken, and I don't think Cliffjumper rates as broken. I don't think any of the exclusive limited cards they've released rate as broken. And so, to me, it's if they are good but not utterly dominant, and I don't believe Cliffjumper ever rose to that level despite the Gen Con win, or even despite the number of people who are using him at Gen Con. I don't think it's a bad thing for the game. And at that point it becomes more of a collector's issue. If you had to have Cliffjumper to play and compete and make top 8 or top 16, then yes, that's a problem. But I don't think it was there, and I think that a lot of people tended to take their dislike in concept of exclusive cards and look at the one big win and again turn it up to 11. But I also say that he's it was a big burst after Gen Con, but he seems to fade off. I mean, you still see him show up in decks from time to time, but I don't think anyone came out of the Invitational at PAX thinking that it was time to go by Cliffjumper. But that's also going to be on anything. I know that Cliffjumper had unusually big numbers, the day after, or even, that evening. I was talking to someone, they had been watching it, and the prices on the Galaxy Primes had jumped from like $60 to $80. And I tend to think that when Cliffjumper was running 100, 120, yes, that's a lot of money to pay for a bit of cardboard, but Optimus wasn't that far behind, and it wasn't that, Battlefield Legend wasn't that far behind back in the day. And so, I think a lot of people get wrapped up in the things they cannot have without necessarily considering the state of the overall community and what they can get to. There's a lot of people playing where, a $60 card is just as out of reach as a $120 card. And I try and at least look at it more holistically. Either we have a game that everybody can get everything, something like Fantasy Flight's living card game model, or this is just part of the price of it, and there are going to be expensive cards. It's not much different. Everyone considers still that Security Checkpoint, Piece of Tyranny are almost mandatory cards if in a heavy blue and orange deck. I believe they were running $15 to $20 each last time I looked. You need 3 of them. Now you're into that $60 range for a playset there too. So I tend to think that it's a combination of just general dislike of exclusives and sort of a FOMO on a personal level, rather than looking at the community as a whole. And I think if you really want to fix it, fix everything for the community as a whole, or decide it's okay for the community as a whole. I think that middle point where people are only upset about the cards they can't get, I have a little more issue with.
Well said. I agree with you, especially on that last point. It definitely is that FOMO piece, and I feel like I've read or heard you say at one point Cliffjumper could have been replaced by other similar cost cards, and almost had the same effect. Maybe not all the way, but could have been swapped out.
Yeah, I tend to think so. I think, for my deck, he sits in a really unique spot. But there are other cards that give the card draw. Wheeljack is only 1 star more. He kind of breaks the 4 wide pattern that I went with that deck. But, Wheeljack is arguably a far better character at 9 stars than Cliffjumper is for his 8. And that may be coming out wrong, but for that 1 other star, you get more than 1 additional star's value out of Cliffjumper, or out of Wheeljack. Sorry. So, I think that there's always choices, and there are ways to do what you want your deck to do that never needed him.
Would you say, and I've asked this question to your fellow competitors, would you say that the pilot, the battle deck, or the characters are the most important? And which one, if you had to pick 2, which 2 would you pick as the most important?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I have to say the pilot. I don't believe any decent CCG, and I think that Transformers is, you cannot hand someone a deck and expect them to run it blind or whatever. And so, and I think that's very true in Transformers as well. And, I going back to the after Gen Con, there was obviously a lot of analysis, a lot of people. I watched a fair number of streams of people running, the deck that I did or something very close to it. And, there were plenty of places where I looked at it and said, okay, that was a misplay. You could have done that better. So I think the pilot is a very, very important thing. Second to that, I would say the characters. The fact that they start in play, the fact that they stay in play, the fact that keeping them in play is in many ways your win condition. There's no variance to them. And it's one of the reasons actually to climb up on my soapbox. I don't think Transformers is a great game for sealed play. Because there's so little choice in sealed as far as the battle cards that you get. I think most decks you're going to leave out like 4 or 5 cards. And then the characters will start in play and be in play, and that makes those character draws much, much more important and dramatically increases the variance. So I tend to think that the characters are the second most important. But at the same time, I will again go back to the idea that you need your characters to do something. They are part of a cohesive whole, but they are filling roles as opposed to just being them. And in a lot of ways, a lot of times, you can find other characters that will fill the same roles and do nearly as well. And I think that's why you can see a lot of decks that run similar cores but with some variation. What the probably the second half of the meta that I saw in Vegas was the Airstrike Patrol plus something. I probably saw 4 or 5, maybe 6 decks running Airstrike Patrols, and almost all of them had that last character with something different. Whether it was, I saw General Optimus, I saw Grimlock, a couple others, and Nemesis is popular as well. So they all managed to fill a similar role in that deck. Now, sometimes you can't replace them. I mean, the Airstrike is a much tighter tribal connection than a lot of what we've seen in Transformers. But they need to fill roles, so there is still some variation there. And again, you can't just take someone's character lineup and run with it and expect it to work perfectly well without the other moving parts.
Yeah. And the level of variance in a battle deck, I mean, you try your best limiting it to 40 cards so your ratios are correct, but with the lack of searchability outside of the green pip and some character abilities, if you're trying to find, let's say your strategy hinges on unleashed potential, there's no guarantee that you're going to get that in your hand. So like you said, the static element of the characters is very important.
Yes, and you're exactly right. I mean, Transformers is a game. You have a very small starting hand size. You have a very low draw rate, and so you'll go through a game, and most games, by the time you're done, assuming you don't have any additional draw, you're going to draw maybe 8 to 9 cards or so in an average game. And so you're going to see a quarter of your deck in your hand, and I think that's why most people still tend to focus heavily on pips, because they're going to be the more prevalent thing, and so you have to balance the cards you won't see with maximizing the utility that you're going to get out of the ones that you do. And that's why I think, I remember when I talked to Stefan after Gen Con, I didn't run Improvised Shield, and we had a funny moment where he texted me after I'd done the deck profile, and it's like, I didn't even realize this when we were talking, that you're not running that. It was such a crazy thought that it hadn't even clicked as we were going through with really either of us, that wasn't there. And as I told him, I don't run them because those card draws are so important. I don't want a dead card for the sake of 1 or 2 more damage through the course of my deck. And so, I think it's a really fine balance. It's one of the things I love about the game, that even with pips being more important, you can't just slam, as many oranges or whatever as you can. You really have to maximize the utility that get out of the cards that you do draw and that you do play.
Right. Yeah. A handheld blaster or an improvised shield in hand can be fatal, right? So
yep.
You may be better off playing a zap instead of an improvised shield.
Exactly.
So you spoke a little bit about the sealed play bit, and I know that kind of references back a little bit to the EI in December. There'll most likely be one in 2020. What did you think was done well at the EI?
That's an interesting thing. I was fairly vocal after that. I didn't necessarily enjoy the event. I've taken a lot of flack from some of the more competitive players for thinking that, how dare I ask for a lunch break, that it just wouldn't be possible. I will say I do have to give props. I think there were some issues running it, but they did the best they could and a decent job, given especially like John Temple has been very upfront that they were short on judges and kind of how that came to pass. I thought that for the environment and what it is, it was run okay. It certainly was not a train wreck. I never wanted to give that impression to anybody. I thought the split to the cut on the last day was good. I thought the coverage was good. I really liked that they did one match at a time for most of the top 8, so that it could be a very spectator oriented thing. So overall, I mean, it was not a horrible event by any means, but it made for a very long day with some very like the sealed, especially the scheduling of it, made for a very disruptive segment in the middle of the day where everyone's going and in the zone and doing, and then we had an hour-long break while you do the decks, and we sat there, and it's the type of thing that very much annoys me, and I know that why they do it, and that I'll even say it's probably the right thing to do. But for anyone who wasn't there, we were sitting there, and it was calling out, okay, now you're going to open your packs, now you're going to do this, now you're going to pass this sheet over, and it was all very much, you should not be doing anything except for what we're telling you. So it meant a lot of sort of least common denominator timing, where it was a long poll. You had to wait for every single person to finish this piece. It was also one with all the instructions where it was very, very hard to hear in the hall, and it just really, really killed the momentum on the day, even apart from whatever else I happened to feel about Sealed. So I would love to see separate events for Sealed. I have no problem with the format. I think it is excessively random to drop into the middle of a constructed event. And I'll again call back to Blaine on that. I mean, I think hands down he had the most dominant constructed deck on the day, and had a little bit of a bad pull on the Sealed, and ends up missing the top 8 despite hands down stampeding everybody else that he faced with that deck. So I hope they will split the events rather than making the sort of mixed, so that we have focus on the constructed in a minimal variance environment, and then kind of do a completely separate event to highlight the separate skills that go into Sealed play, and kind of accepts that level of variance.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the first trading card game in a while that I've gotten wholly into and invested in, and to make something analogous to the Super Bowl that's coming up. In the Super Bowl, they would not say, "Hey, we're going to swap out your first stringers with third stringers, but we're not going to tell you who until they're out on the field with you." So I don't know if it's been announced or if this is common, but why would there be a Sealed event in a constructed event, especially one that is a capstone event?
Right. Yeah, I like it. I have a football analogy myself too. It's like, at halftime you make your linemen go out and they're going to run 100-yard dashes, and whichever team's linemen win are going to get an extra touchdown, right? I fully respect that there are different skills involved in Sealed, but I question the mixing of them. And again, with the higher variance in Sealed, I am just not really a fan of it. So yeah, we'll see what they decide to do. But my personal feeling at this point is that there's a lot of things going on right now that are just sort of the way that it's done, and that was a lot of the response that I got that was negative to my views on the EI, was that, oh, this is just how it's always done. I think we can do better. I think we can isolate the skills and evaluate them on their own merits. I think we can improve scheduling to the point where we aren't spending 20 minutes between every round, and so people can actually manage to have a lunch break or a reasonable schedule to it. And I believe that there's options for things like this to use technology. There are a number of apps out there that handle app notifications and table notifications. You take away 5-10 minutes worth of that swarm around the postings board every round, and the whole day gets a lot smoother. And it's interesting that I see these things a lot of times at local stores with 12 or 14 players, but then and you need it far less there than you do at an event with 150 players, but we tend not to see them at the bigger events. So I again, full props to the people who do this. I run enough events locally. I know it's a hard thing to do, but at the same time, if I see areas that can improve, nobody's perfect, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement, and there's a lot of room for recognizing that Transformers launched launched as a different style of game. It was originally intended to be a more accessible game that could bring everyone in. And I'll be honest, I was a little worried when they first announced the organized play with the big dollars that it was going to lose some of that. And I think a lot of what we saw out of the EI is going in that direction. And we're losing that accessibility that this is a game that can bring everybody in and make sure everyone enjoys it. And so, I hope that going forward, we can keep the competitive spirit, but not shut out anyone who doesn't want to do 20-hour play days if this keeps getting bigger.
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, it is all in all, even though some of us have nostalgia, it was part of our childhoods. I mean, you're right. It is bots mashing against bots. It's supposed to be accessible and lighthearted. And when there's money on the line, hey, we understand that things that can get a little tense and so on and so forth. And especially if the event isn't 100% tight, that can also add some, just add more to the pile. So
agreed.
Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for jumping on. I really appreciate our conversation, and I hope you have a great 2020 in terms of competitive Transformers, and hope everything is awesome in Orlando. And I hope to see you at Gen Con. Are you going to be at Gen Con this year?
I will be. Last couple of years, Gen Con has been an annual trip for me. So I am there pretty much every year. Other than that, we'll see what happens for the year.
Okay. Well, Indiana is pretty close to where I am, so most likely I will see you there.
Look forward to it.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me today too. I always enjoy chatting these, and anyone who's willing to give me a soapbox, I'm happy to take some time. So appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.